Hi everybody, welcome to Stormdance Television. Judging in dance battles requires not only experience and attention, but also a method for making fair and consistent decisions in real time. In battles, judges are mostly asked to evaluate the dancers by the use of a round-for-round system. One round is based on two performances. One performance on the left and one on the right. Each with distinct material, presence and approach. And to compare them under conditions that are often unfamiliar, fast-paced and cognitively demanding. In such situations, the decisions that are made do not arise from neutral observation alone. They are shaped by prior knowledge because the judges should be experts in their fields. And then it also matters in which sequence the performances unfold, which means it matters who goes first and who goes second. Without such a framework, judging can become mainly guided by initial impressions, habitual expectations, and biases, which is mostly subjective then. This video introduces Bayesian reasoning as a model for tracking and adjusting impressions as new material appears. Rather than treating each dancer as an isolated case, Bayesian reasoning encourages judges to work with comparative assessments. To make this reasoning process practically usable, we combine it with the Threefold, a judging tool that divides a performance into three domains, into physical, artistic, and interpretive qualities. The Threefold is not a scoring system. It is a perceptual structure that helps judges remain attentive to difference across multiple dimensions. Its use of crossfaders, representing the magnitude of difference between two dancers, creates a clear visual and cognitive interface for comparative judgment. Together, Bayesian reasoning and the Threefold form a method for transparent, structured, and dynamic evaluation. They do not replace artistic judgment, but support it, by clarifying how assessments are formed, how they shift, and how attention can be distributed more fairly. This process shows how judging can be understood as an evolving act of assessment building, how Bayesian reasoning helps to track and refine that process, and how the Threefold supports it through consistent and observable application. Judging is often assumed to be just a matter of recognizing quality and naming a winner, and that's it. But in reality, it is a dynamic process of observing, interpreting, comparing, and revising assessments. This process unfolds gradually and is shaped by a constant interplay between what a judge expects and what is actually presented. This confronts us with mainly two problems. When we talk about expectations here, the anchor bias is something that immediately comes to mind here. The anchor bias is a tendency to let first impression or prior knowledge set a mental starting point, which is the anchor then that influences how all subsequent information is interpreted. That's what happens a lot when certain celebrities enter a battle, for example. Then perception rarely begins with the first movement. It begins earlier with expectation. Prior knowledge about a dancer, whether it is gained through past battles, reputation, or video footage, creates that cognitive anchor, and this anchor is not a neutral reference point. It is a bias, a mental shortcut, and a prejudice that pre-shapes how upcoming performances of battles are perceived. This is pretty problematic because it shifts the frame of evaluation before the upcoming performances have been observed. So, anchoring is not a conscious decision, nor is it a reliable shortcut. It alters both perception and comparison, and it cannot be removed through effort alone. Recognizing its presence is the first step. The next is to adopt a method that allows perception to be recalibrated by evidence, rather than steered by memory and expectation. That's why structure, like judging methods and models, are needed to keep judges on the rational track. So secondly, the process is also shaped by the limitations of attention. Without a structure, the judges may unconsciously focus on the areas they are most comfortable with. Then they are cherry picking. That's another cognitive fallacy, since they are not observing the entire spectrum, but zoom into just a few chosen criteria and so have a fragmented vision. A good judging process does not rely on instinct or fixed standards. It relies on responsive observation, which is the ability to track and adjust impressions as more information becomes available. In this sense, judging is not simply a matter of making a final decision after the round has ended. The decision that emerges is the result of an ongoing process of comparison, where assessments are formed, adjusted, and refined as each dancer presents their material. This impression is not fixed, it evolves. The better it is structured, the more likely it is to reflect the actual qualities presented, rather than habits of thought or the influence of expectation. Now let me give you a brief explanation of the Bayesian theory. Bayesian theory is named after Thomas Bayes, an English statistician and Presbyterian minister who lived in the 18th century. Although he never published it himself, his key work, an essay towards solving a problem in the doctrine of chances, was discovered after his death and then published in 1763 by his friend Richard Price. The work introduced a mathematical framework for updating probabilities as new evidence becomes available, what we now call Bayes' theorem. Originally, Bayes' interest lay in understanding how to revise a probability estimate when faced with new data. His work was later extended and formalized by Pierre-Simon Laplace, who used it in scientific and philosophical reasoning. Today, Bayesian thinking is used in fields as diverse as statistics, machine learning, medicine, law, and as shown here, even in dance judging. The original mathematical formula of Bayes' theorem is here, where this here is prior probability, which is the initial estimate before seeing the evidence. This is the likelihood, which is the probability of seeing the evidence if the hypothesis is true. This is the probability of the evidence occurring under all possible scenarios. And this is the posterior probability, the updated estimate after seeing the evidence. I know this looks complicated, so before I lose most of the people watching the video, I suggest we use the simplified version, or better, the plain language format, to make this easier to understand in everyday terms. The formula then is often rewritten like this. So this version captures the same structure. Prior belief is your impression before seeing the new material. Likelihood is how well the new material fits to what you expected. Evidence is the overall chance of seeing this type of material. And updated belief, the posterior, is your refined impression after weighing the new evidence. So, Bayesian reasoning starts with prior knowledge, what we already believe or expect before seeing new information. When new evidence appears, we evaluate how well it fits with that prior belief and how likely it would be if our assumptions were correct. Based on that comparison, we update our prior belief into a refined, adjusted assessment, called the posterior, which becomes the new starting point for further reasoning. This structure helps judges reflect on how their assessments are formed and how they should shift in response to what actually happens during a round of a battle. So, Bayesian reasoning provides a model for how assessments should evolve as new information becomes available. But for this model to be usable in practice, especially in the fast-paced environment of battle judging, it needs a clear, accessible structure. And this is where the threefold comes in. The threefold is a method of comparative evaluation structured around three fundamental spheres or dimensions of dance performance. Each of these dimensions are represented by a crossfader in an interface. A sliding visual scale that allows a judge to express the magnitude of difference between the two dancers along a given axis. The threefold does not assign fixed scores. It's not a checklist. It is a framework for comparison, one that helps the judge register where and how dancers differ, and to what extent. Now let's get into how Bayesian reasoning operates through the threefold. The combined use of Bayesian reasoning and the threefold model is not a theoretical layer added after a battle. It is embedded directly in the workflow of comparative judging. So now I'm going to describe how this process unfolds step by step in a battle round, with each moment contributing to the structured refinement of an assessment. So here we go. In step 1, dancer A performs. At the start of the round, the threefold faders are in a neutral position. The judge may hold a prior opinion about dancer A, but this needs to be set aside. The earlier explained anchoring bias, the tendency to let past knowledge shape expectations, must absolutely be actively resisted. When dancer A starts dancing, the focus must be on mentally recording what's actually happening in this specific moment, on nothing else. So during dancer A's performance, the judge begins collecting indicative material, various catalysts, anything that appears convincing, meaningful, or compositionally significant, and maps them to the relevant categories: physical qualities, artistic qualities, or interpretive qualities. These catalysts are not yet evaluated as stronger or weaker. They are simply registered as present. As they occur, they are mentally organized and linked to the appropriate crossfader, where they will later serve as reference points for comparison. To make this a little bit more tangible, take a look at the diagram I've included here. It shows many of the terms judges often use to describe vital catalysts. To support consistency and clarity, a broad vocabulary really helps. Because here's the thing, if you don't know a concept, you can't recognize it. For example, if the idea of syncopation is unfamiliar to you, chances are you won't spot it in a dancer's musical play. That's a blind spot. And it's why educating yourself as a judge really matters. The words you see in the diagram are key terms that help describe what's being observed and where it belongs. It's not a complete list, of course. It will never be complete, but it gives a sense of the terrain. Some examples: originality, surprise, intention, impact, structure, musicality, athleticism. All of these help judges organize impressions without reducing the performance to a checklist. So what's happening here is what we might call benchmark formation. Dancer A's performance creates a kind of reference structure, a provisional internal model of the performance. No fader is moved yet. That is very important, because comparison hasn't even begun, but the landscape is set. So, as dancer A performs, the judge begins gathering information and forms an initial impression based on what is observed. This impression becomes the starting point, the prior, against which the second dancer will now be compared. So here comes step 2. Dancer B performs. Now the comparative phase begins. Dancer B enters with new material, some of it familiar, some contrasting, some unexpected. The judge continues observing, now with the reference of dancer A, also known as the prior, in mind. The same procedure is applied again. The judge now maps anything evocative, anything that carries weight, any performed material that functions as evidence to the 3 categories of physical, artistic, and interpretive qualities. Each move, each combination is a potential catalyst. And every one of them has the power to shift the judge's impression, because all content is evaluated in direct relation to the benchmarks created by dancer A. Now you might ask, how do I compare different kinds of catalysts with one another? That's where upsizing comes into play. By mapping each catalyst to a broader concept, they can be organized in a layered system of classification, moving from specific to general, from micro to macro. For example, you take the word balance. Balance is a part of athleticism, which is part of technique, which ultimately falls under physical qualities. Or you take the element of surprise, which is part of impact, which again is part of composition, that is part of performance, and ultimately part of interpretive qualities. So now, toward the end of dancer B's entry, the judge begins to assess the magnitude of contrast between the two dancers within each domain. That's when the crossfaders are going to be moved and come into play. Not based on isolated moments, but on cumulative difference. These faders function like scales, showing how far one dancer outweighs the other in physical, artistic, or interpretive terms. This is where the Bayesian reasoning really becomes active. The impression formed after dancer A, the prior, is now being updated by the new evidence from dancer B. The faders visualize that update. They don't represent fixed values, they respond to the degree of difference observed in real time. These adjustments reflect the updated impression, the posterior. So once dancer B finishes, the faders are adjusted. They are moved from their neutral positions into their final positions. Each fader represents 1/3 of the entire spectrum, and they can be seen like scales that get out of balance, depending on the weight or better the magnitude its designated aspects hold. They reflect the outcome of a structured evidence-based comparison. At this point, the judge holds a calibrated impression, not one shaped by habit or expectation, but built through observation and refined through the threefold. The interface makes this visible. The fader positions might be converted into a percentage-based or degree-based output, showing by how much a dancer dominated within each domain and across the round as a whole. By mapping each quality to a specific fader, the judge avoids generalization and sharpens transparency in the process. Instead of arriving at a vague or intuitive verdict, the final result is the outcome of a structured comparative process, guided by clarity, balance, and a shared conceptual language. In this way, the threefold also helps prevent the earlier mentioned cherry picking. Without a structured method, judges may unconsciously overemphasize an aspect or focus only on parts of the dance they are most attuned to, while missing others, of course. The threefold combats this by forcing perceptual balance. The judge is required to research and consider all three dimensions before arriving at a decision. So, 1. The just explained step-by-step process mirrors the logic of Bayesian reasoning. And 2. The threefold allows the judge to track how their impression evolves, using a structured system that registers both dancers' material comparatively, breaks down perception into clear categories, and protects against disproportionate focus on isolated moments or preferences. Importantly, the threefold works not just as a judging tool, but as a perceptual aid. It helps judging clarify what they are observing, where the differences lie, and how strongly those differences appear. Instead of a vague overall impression, it produces an organized internal picture, one that supports the Bayesian process of refining impressions through evidence. Okay, so what should we take away from this? Judging in battles is complex. It requires fast comparative decision-making in situations where attention, expectation, and familiarity are constantly shifting. Like any interpretive process, it's open to bias, not because judges lack experience or insight, but because impressions evolve in real time, often under pressure. That's why structure matters. A well-designed framework doesn't limit judgment, it supports it. It helps make the process more transparent, more consistent, and more consciously guided, without flattening the individuality of the art form. Bayesian reasoning provides the mental model. It reminds us that our impressions are not fixed, they evolve. A strong initial impression is not a conclusion, it's a starting point. As new material appears, that impression should be questioned, revised, and updated. This process doesn't require mathematics. It requires awareness. An understanding that perception itself is dynamic and that fairness depends on our ability to adapt to what is actually happening in front of us. The threefold provides the method. It gives judges a clear, manageable framework to track difference across physical, artistic, and interpretive dimensions. The faders work like visual scales. They allow the gradation, direct comparison, and clean documentation of difference, and that structure supports objectivity. By working together, Bayesian reasoning and the threefold don't just support better decisions, they make the whole judging process more cognitively efficient. One offers the cognitive model and the other offers a practical method for applying it. That's it, party people. If you enjoyed this and want to support the work, feel free to follow the channel. And if you're looking to deepen your understanding of dance interpretation, check out my book, Think Breaking. It's available on Amazon. Thanks for watching and have a great day. See you soon.